Welcome, nighttime traveler, to Sleepy Bedtime Stories, your haven of stories and tales to help you sleep. This is the place where traditional tales come to life and accompany you on your journey to rest. But first, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I'd love to know if you're joining me from your bed, from a cozy sofa, or perhaps from some corner of the world where you can still feel the spirit of ancient tales. Please leave me a comment. Every message from you is like a fragment of a precious amphora. If you'd like to support this space of peace and relaxation, subscribe and share the channel so that more people can find their refuge here. And now, take a slow, deep breath, because tonight we're going to dive into another thrilling story.
The Room Where Time Slowed Down. Chapter 1. The Minute That Learned to Wait. Night falls on a small, forgotten town in some corner of the world. Its name matters not, for places like this exist everywhere, suspended between memory and oblivion, inhabited by people who live their lives amidst the constant murmur of time. But in this town, on a narrow street flanked by trees that have seen decades pass, there is a house that holds a secret. A grey stone house, with tall windows and wooden shutters worn by countless winters. On the third floor of this house, at the end of a corridor that creaks under the lightest of footsteps, there is a room. And in that room, time does not work as it should. The story we are about to discover began on an autumn afternoon in the year 1953. The leaves were falling with that slowness typical of seasons bidding farewell, swirling in golden spirals before settling on the damp pavement. At that time, the house belonged to a family called Montero. They were simple people, hard-working, the sort of family who build their lives brick by brick, without fuss or pretensions. Mr. Montero worked at the post office. Mrs. Montero looked after the house and their two children, Clara and Tomas. Children with big eyes and boundless curiosity. It was Clara, the eldest, who first noticed something strange. She was 11 at the time, an age when children can still perceive what adults have learned to ignore is less than #2 number, is greater than that October afternoon. Clara had been sent to her room as a punishment for coming home late from school. Her room, specifically the one on the third floor, at the end of the corridor. The light slanted in through the window, creating rectangles of sunlight that moved slowly across the wooden floor. Clara sat on her bed, with her arms crossed and her brow furrowed, determined to show her indignation through the most absolute silence. But then something peculiar happened. She looked at the wall clock hanging opposite her bed, an antique clock with Roman numerals and bronze hands that had belonged to her grandmother. The second hand ticked along as usual, marking the relentless passage of her punishment. Clara sighed, mentally calculating how many seconds remained until her 1-hour sentence was over. 60 minutes. 3,600 seconds. An eternity for an 11-year-old girl. She closed her eyes, trying to make time pass more quickly through sheer willpower. That trick all children try at some point without success. When she opened them again, something had changed. The second hand was still moving, but more slowly. It wasn't an optical illusion or a trick of her imagination. She could clearly see how the hand took more than a second to complete its movement. 2 seconds. 3. The ticking of the clock sounded deeper, more spaced out, as if the mechanism were running out of wind. Clara got out of bed and approached the sea, lock cautiously, as if approaching an animal that might be startled. She reached out and touched the protective glass. It was cold, as always. The clock was working perfectly, or so it seemed, except for that unsettling detail. Time had become thick, viscous, like honey spilling from a jar. The girl looked out of the window. In the street, a woman was walking her dog. Her movements were normal. A car drove past at its usual speed. The leaves continued to fall from the trees at the same steady pace as always. The outside world was functioning correctly. It was only in there, in that room, where time had decided to pause and catch its breath. Clara ran out of the room, crossed the hallway and ran down the stairs 2 at a time. In the kitchen, her mother was peeling potatoes with rhythmic, precise movements. The kitchen clock showed the correct time. Clara looked at her own wristwatch, a gift for her 10th birthday. It was also working normally. She went back upstairs, this time more slowly, her heart racing not exactly from fear, but from a mixture of wonder and excitement that only children can feel in the face of the inexplicable. When she went back into her room, the phenomenon was still happening. The second hand of the wall clock moved with that hypnotic slowness, as if every second were a small effort that time had to make to keep moving forward. Clara sat down on the floor, with her back against the wall, and simply watched Ed. She didn't know how long she spent like that. It could have been an hour. It could have been 5 minutes. In that room, the distinction had ceased to make sense. When her mother called her down for dinner, Clara came downstairs in a state of reverie that Mrs. Montero attributed to the punishment. During dinner, the girl barely spoke. Tomas, her younger brother, filled the silence with his incessant chatter about the day's adventures at school, about the cat he'd found in the courtyard, about 1,000 trivial things that, at 7 years old, seemed momentous to him. Clara ate mechanically, her mind still on that room on the 3rd floor, on that clock that had forgotten how to tick. That night, when the family went to bed, Clara stayed awake. The full moon cast silvery shadows on the walls of her room. The wall clock was ticking normally again. The second hand moved at its usual pace, each tick-tock marking exactly 1 second. No more, no less. Clara felt almost disappointed. Perhaps she had imagined it. Perhaps it had been just a daydream, one of those fantasies the mind creates to escape boredom. But she hadn't imagined it. The next day, whilst doing her maths homework at the small desk by the window, it happened again. This time it was more subtle. It wasn't the clock that gave it away, but the light. The afternoon was drawing in with that gentle quality characteristic of October, when the days grow shorter but still retain some of the summer's warmth. Clara had started her exercises at 4:30 in the afternoon, when the light was clear and bright. Normally, at that time of year, the light would begin to change noticeably after half an hour, taking on those golden hues of dusk. But Clara had been working for what felt to her like much longer than half an hour, and the light had barely changed. She looked at the wall clock. It read 4:37. Only 7 minutes had passed. Impossible. She had solved 10 maths problems. She had sharpened her pencil twice. She had looked out of the window several times, daydreaming. It couldn't have been just 7 minutes. She ran down to the kitchen. The clock there read 5:15. 45 minutes. That made more sense. That matched what she had experienced. She went back upstairs, this time taking the small kitchen clock with her, a stopwatch. Her father sometimes used to time the development of his photographs. She placed it next to the wall clock and set both to the correct time. It was 5:05. Clara sat on her bed and watched. For the first few minutes, both clocks ran in unison. Tick-tock, tick-tock, perfectly synchronized. But gradually, so gradually that it was almost imperceptible, the wall clock began to fall behind. At first, it was a matter of fractions of a second. Then, full seconds. The kitchen timer read 5:25 when the wall clock had barely reached D. 5:23. Clara felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Something was happening there that defied everything she had been taught about how the world works. Time, that invisible, relentless constant that governs every aspect of existence, was behaving erratically in her room. It hadn't stopped completely. That would have been too dramatic, too obvious. No, it was more subtle than that. Time had simply decided to slow down, like a weary traveler who stops to rest halfway along the road. Over the following weeks, Clara became a meticulous observer of this phenomenon. She discovered that it did not happen all the time. There were periods, sometimes lasting hours, sometimes days, when everything functioned normally. But then, without warning, time in her room would thicken again, slow down, as if she were moving through a medium denser than air. Clara kept a notebook in which she noted down each episode, recording the time according to the wall clock and the actual time according to her wristwatch. The discrepancies varied. Sometimes they were minimal, barely a few minutes. Other times they were considerable, reaching a difference of more than half an hour. He tried to explain it to his parents one evening over dinner. Mr. Montero listened with that look of benevolent patience that adults reserve for children's fantasies. He explained to Clara that mechanical watches sometimes go out of time, that perhaps the mechanism needed cleaning or oiling, that one shouldn't look for mysteries where there were only practical explanations. Mrs. Montero suggested that perhaps Clara was spending too much time alone in her room, that she should go out more, play with other children, take her mind off things. Thomas, for his part, declared that it all sounded very boring and asked permission to leave the table. Clara did not insist. She learnt, as all children eventually do, that there are certain experiences that cannot be shared with adults. Not because adults are incapable of understanding, but because they have lost the ability to see. They have polished their lenses of reality so much that anything that does not fit into their predefined categories simply slides off without leaving a trace, like water on glass. It was on a November afternoon, when autumn was already giving way to winter and the first mists were beginning to creep up the streets, that Clara made a discovery that would change her understanding of the phenomenon. She was reading a book, an adventure novel she had borrowed from the school library. It was one of those stories that capture the imagination, full of shipwrecks and hidden treasures and brave characters who brave storms. Clara was so absorbed in her reading that she didn't notice when time began to slow down again. She was in the middle of a particularly exciting chapter when the story's protagonist found himself trapped in a cave with the tide rising, when suddenly Clara realized something extraordinary. She wasn't reading any slower. Her eyes continued to move over the words at the same pace as always. Her mind processed the sentences just as quickly. But she had more time. It was as if every minute had expanded, offering her more space, more duration. She could savor every word, every sentence, every plot twist with a focus that was normally impossible for her. It wasn't that she was reading more slowly. It was that time was giving her more of itself. She closed the book and looked around. The room was bathed in that grayish light of cloudy November afternoons. Everything seemed normal, but Clara could feel it now. That different quality of the air, that particular density of the moment. It was like being underwater, but without the resistance. The sounds from the house reached her muffled. The hum of the radio downstairs, where her father was listening to the news. Her mother's footsteps in the kitchen. The distant barking of a dog in the street. Everything came through filtered, softened, as if passing through layers of something that wasn't exactly material but was there. She got up and went to the window. Outside, in the neighbor's garden, there was a bare tree against the grey sky. A leaf, the last one clinging to a high branch, came loose just then. Clara saw it fall, but it did not fall as leaves normally do. It fell with a sublime slowness, spinning round and round in a dance that seemed choreographed, descending in spirals that Clara could follow with her eyes, appreciating every movement, every turn. It took what seemed like minutes for it to reach the ground, although Clara knew that in normal time, that fall would have lasted barely a few seconds. It was then that she understood. It wasn't time that was changing, or at least not just time. It was her relationship with it. In that room, for some reason she couldn't explain, Clara had access to more time than she was entitled to. Every minute she spent there contained more life, more experience, more opportunity to be. It was as if the universe were giving her a gift, offering her minutes that had learned to wait, not to rush, to give themselves completely. The months passed. Winter settled in with its long nights and frosty mornings. Christmas came and went, with its rituals of lights and presents and lavish meals. Clara turned 12 in January 1954. The phenomenon in her room continued, unpredictable but constant. Some days it functioned normally. Other days, time expanded, stretched out, became generous. Clara had learned to recognize the signs. There was a certain quality to the light, even on cloudy days. A particular silence that was not the absence of sound but the presence of stillness. A sensation in her chest, as if her breath found more space between each inhalation and exhalation. When she felt these signs, she knew that time in her room had entered that special state, that slowed down mode of existence that allowed her to live each moment more fully. He began to use this time deliberately. When he had a book he really wanted to enjoy, he would wait for his room to enter that state and then immerse himself in reading, savoring every page. When he had difficult maths problems to solve, he found that his mind worked better in that expanded time, as if he had more space to think, to consider different approaches. Even the most mundane tasks, such as tidying his things or sewing on a button, took on a meditative quality, almost ceremonial. But there was something else, something that took Clara a while to put into words. In that room, when time slowed down, she herself changed. Not physically, of course, but inside, something quietened down. The anxieties that normally buzzed in the back of her mind, worries about school, about whether her classmates liked her, about whether she was letting her parents down. All those inner voices fell silent. They didn't exactly disappear, but they lost their urgency, their ability to unsettle her. In that slow-moving time, there was room for everything. There was room for problems and room for solutions. There was room for sadness and room for joy. Nothing had to be rushed. One afternoon in March, when the first green shoots were beginning to appear on the trees and the air carried that indefinable promise of renewal that characterizes spring, Clara had an unexpected visitor. Her friend Elena had come round to work on a science project together. Elena was a lively girl, always on the go, with an infectious laugh and a curious mind. They went up to Clara's room together, carrying their books and materials. They sat on the floor, surrounded by card, scissors, and glue, working on a model of the solar system. Eleanor chattered away, telling stories about her brothers, about a film she'd seen, about a stray cat she'd secretly adopted and was keeping hidden in the garden shed. Clara listened and laughed, joining in the conversation with the part of her mind that was used to social interaction, whilst another part remained alert, watching for signs. And then it happened. Clara felt it first, that subtle shift in the atmosphere, that peculiar thickening of the moment. She looked at the wall clock. The second hand had begun to slow down. She looked at Elena, waiting. She didn't know what exactly. Would she feel it too? Would she notice it too? But Elena carried on talking, cutting a piece of card into the shape of satin, completely oblivious to the change. Her movements were normal. Her words flowed at their usual pace. For her, time passed as it always did. Clara felt a mixture of fascination and loneliness. The phenomenon was just for her, or at least only she could perceive it. Elena existed in normal time, in that constant and relentless flow that never stops or slows down. Clara, on the other hand, inhabited both times simultaneously. She could see Elena moving at normal speed. She could hear her words spoken at the correct pace. But she herself existed in that expanded time, in those minutes that had learned to wait. It was a strange experience, almost dizzying, like being in two places at once, like being two different people. There was a Clara who responded to Elena, who cut out card and applied glue, who laughed at the jokes and contributed ideas to the project. And there was another Clara, deeper, quieter, who observed all this from that slow time, from that expanded perspective where every moment contained multiplicities. When Elena left, around 6 in the evening, Clara was left alone in her room. The daylight was beginning to fade, tinging the walls with shades of pink and gold. Time had returned to normal, if indeed it had ever ceased to be so for anyone other than her. Clara lay down on her bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of a secret she could not share, that perhaps she could never share. The seasons continued their inexorable cycle. Spring gave way to summer, with its long, bright days, its endless school holidays, its hot afternoons that seemed suspended in a golden eternity. The Montero family spent 2 weeks on the coast, in a small rented house near the sea. Clara enjoyed the beach, the salt water, the shells she collected in a plastic bucket. But part of her missed her room, that space where time behaved in a special way, where the minutes were generous and patient. When they returned home at the end of August, Clara went straight up to her room. Everything was just as she had left it. The books on the shelf, the drawings on the walls, the wall clock with its bronze hands. She sat on her bed and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Time, as if it had missed her, began to slow down almost immediately. Clara closed her eyes and smiled. She was home. She was where she belonged. Autumn had come round again, bringing the annual cycle full circle. Clara had grown, not just in height, though that too. She had grown in understanding, in depth, in that indefinable quality that separates children from teenagers. She was 13 now. At school, her classmates talked about boys and dances and things that Clara found simultaneously fascinating and trivial. She took part in these conversations, but with a certain detachment, like an anthropologist studying the customs of a tribe. Her relationship with the slow time in her room had matured too. It was no longer just a curious phenomenon, a curiosity to observe. It had become an integral part of who she was. It was in those moments of expanded time that Clara found herself, where she could think her own thoughts without the constant interference of the outside world. In normal time, everything moved too quickly. Conversations rushed from one topic to another. Tasks piled up into endless lists. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. But in her room, when time chose to slow down, Clara could breathe. She could simply be. It was in October of that year, 1954, when Clara made another significant discovery. She had started writing. Not schoolwork, but her own thoughts, her own stories. She had found a leather-bound notebook at a flea market, with yellowed pages that smelled of times gone by. In that notebook, she began to record not only the episodes of slow time, but her experiences within them, her reflections, her observations on the nature of time and consciousness. One afternoon, whilst writing in her notebook, sitting on the windowsill with her legs tucked up and the setting sun casting long shadows, Clara realized she could induce the phenomenon. Not always, not consistently, but sometimes. If she concentrated, if she quietened her mind in a certain way, If she breathed at a particular rhythm, slow and deep, she could feel how time around her began to thicken, to slow down. It was like learning to swim. At first, clumsy movements, many failures, but gradually, with practice, he began to understand the mechanism, to develop the skill. She discovered that the key lay in attention. When she paid her full attention, completely, without dividing her consciousness between multiple concerns, when she was fully present in the moment, time responded. It slowed down, not because time itself changed, Clara began to suspect, but because she was experiencing more of it. Every second contained more experience, more perception, more life. It was like the difference between looking distractedly and really seeing, between hearing and listening, between existing passively and living actively. This realization led her to experiment. She began to practice this focused attention not only in her room, but in other places too. In the garden, watching how a spider spun its web between two branches. At school, paying full attention to the words of her literature teacher. At the dinner table, really listening to her brother's stories, seeing him not as a minor nuisance, but as a complete human being with his own inner world. He discovered that although the physical phenomenon of time slowing down seemed limited to his room, the subjective experience, that sensation of expanded time, could be recreated anywhere through the practice of mindfulness. Time did not literally slow down outside his room. Clocks continued to tick away the seconds at their unchanging pace. But her experience of time changed. Moments became richer, fuller, more lived in. That year's winter was particularly harsh. Snow fell heavily in December, covering the city in a white blanket that muffled all sounds. Clara spent long afternoons in her room, looking out of the window as the flakes descended in slow spirals, each one unique, each one fleeting. In the slow passage of time in her room, she could follow the path of a single flake from the moment it appeared in her field of vision until it settled gently on the windowsill. She could see its crystalline structure, its perfect geometry, its transient beauty. One night in January of the year 1955, Clara couldn't sleep. It was a full moon, and its silvery light flooded the room with a ghostly clarity. Clara got out of bed and went to the window. The city slept beneath the snow. Everything was still, silent, as if the whole world had paused to catch its breath. And in that moment of absolute stillness, Clara experienced the most intense phenomenon to date. Time did not merely slow down, it almost stopped. The second hand of the wall clock moved so slowly that Clara could count 5, 6, 7 heartbeats between each tick. The moonlight seemed solid, tangible, as if she could touch it and feel its texture. The silence had depth, layers, nuances she had never perceived before. And in that almost still time, Clara had an experience she could only describe as an understanding, not of anything specific, not of any particular truth, but a broader understanding, a more all-encompassing one. A sense of being connected to something greater than herself, something that included time but was not limited by it. The experience lasted. How long? She couldn't say. Minutes, hours, seconds. Categories had become irrelevant. When time finally returned to normal and Clara could move about easily again, when she returned to her bed and curled up under the blankets, she felt that something fundamental had changed within her. She had touched something, or something had touched her, and she would never be exactly the same again. The years that followed brought their own changes. Clara grew up, as all children do, gradually transforming into a young woman. Time continued its inexorable march, marking birthdays and seasons, successes and failures, joys and sorrows. When she was 15, the Montero family considered moving to a bigger house in another part of the city. Mr. Montero had been promoted. They could afford something better. But Clara begged them not to move. She couldn't explain the real reason without sounding absurd, so she made up other excuses. She liked her school. She had friends in the neighborhood. She didn't want to start over in an unfamiliar place. Her parents, moved by her attachment to the family home, decided to stay. It was during that year, when Clara was 15, that she began to question the deeper meaning of her experience. Why her? Why that room? Was there something special about the place? About the physical structure of the house? Or was it something within her? Some peculiarity of her neurology? Of her perception? She tried to research the history of the house, but found little. It had been built in the late 19th century, around the year 1892, by a fabric merchant whose name had been lost in the dusty archives of the town hall. Several families had lived there over the decades. There were no ghost stories, nor local legends, nor dramatic tragedies that might explain a temporal anomaly. Clara began to read about physics and the nature of time. She found books in the library on relativity and how time dilates under certain conditions, and how it is not the absolute constant it appears to be. She learned that time flows differently depending on the speed at which one moves and on the gravity to which one is subjected. But none of this explained her experience. She wasn't moving at speeds close to the speed of light. There were no anomalous gravitational fields on the third floor of a Victorian house in a small town. She considered the possibility that it was all an illusion, a trick of her mind. But the clocks didn't lie. The kitchen timer and the wall clock showed real, measurable differences. And even if only she could perceive it, the phenomenon was objective, at least in the sense that it affected real physical objects. It wasn't just a subjective sensation. Eventually, Clara came to a conclusion that perhaps wasn't a conclusion at all, but an acceptance. There were things in the universe that could not be fully explained, mysteries that defied rational analysis, and perhaps that was all right. Perhaps not everything needed an explanation. Perhaps it was enough simply to experience, to be present, to receive the gift that the universe, for its own reasons, had decided to offer her. At 16, Clara had developed a routine. Every afternoon, after coming home from school, she would spend at least an hour in her room. Sometimes time would slow down, to sometimes it wouldn't. But even when it was running normally, Clara had learned to bring to that space the quality of attention and presence that she had cultivated over the years. She did her homework there, not hurriedly but carefully. She read there, not to finish books, but to inhabit them. She wrote in her notebook, which had now become several notebooks, filling pages with reflections on time, consciousness, existence. Her schoolmates thought she was a bit odd, a bit aloof, not in an unpleasant way. Clara was kind. She helped anyone in need. She took part in activities when asked. But there was something about her, her quality of being slightly out of sync with the rest of the world, like a musical note played half a beat after the others. Some perceived it as serenity, others as distraction. Clara made no attempt to correct any of these perceptions. She knew who she was. She knew where she found her center. In the spring of 1957, when Clara was about to turn 17, something unexpected happened. Her brother Tomas, now a restless 11-year-old boy, walked into her room without knocking. Clara was sitting on her bed, with her legs crossed, simply breathing, watching the afternoon light play on the walls. Time was slow, very slow. The air had that particular density that Clara had come to love. Tomas burst in, as he always did. He had something to tell her, something about a football match at school, something urgent and important in the universe of an 11-year-old boy. But when he crossed the threshold, he stopped. His expression changed. The urgency faded from his face, replaced by confusion, then by astonishment. He looked around, slowly, as if seeing the room for the first time. He looked at the wall clock. He looked at his own wristwatch. He looked at Clara, and in his eyes, Clara saw recognition. He felt it too. He, too, was experiencing time standing still. Neither spoke for what seemed like minutes, though according to the clocks it was barely seconds. Finally, Tomas whispered, in a voice full of wonder, "What is this?" And Clara, after years of keeping her secret, after years of living this experience in solitude, smiled and replied, "It is the time you have learned to wait for." Tomas stayed in the room that day for what, in normal time, was 20 minutes, but which to both of them seemed like hours. Clara tried to explain to him what she had experienced for years, but found that words were inadequate. Some things can only be understood through direct experience. So instead of explaining, she simply stayed with him, sharing that expanded space, that augmented present. When Tomas finally emerged, dazed and transformed, Clara knew that something had changed fundamentally. She was no longer alone in this. There was a witness. There was someone else who knew, who had touched that mystery. And although Tomas, in the days that followed, tried to experience it again without Clara and discovered he couldn't, that the phenomenon seemed to require her presence, the fact that he had experienced it was enough. There was external confirmation that Clara wasn't mad. She wasn't imagining things. She wasn't living out an elaborate fantasy. The following months were spent exploring it together. Tomas often came to Clara's room, hoping that time would slow down. Sometimes it happened Sometimes it didn't. They discovered there were certain patterns. It happened more easily in the afternoons, between 5 and 7. It happened more in autumn and winter than in spring and summer. It happened more when they were calm, receptive, not trying to force it, but allowing it to happen. Clara tried to teach Tomas what she had learned about mindfulness, about being present. But Tomas, with the impatience typical of an 11-year-old, struggled with the stillness that the phenomenon seemed to require. Even so, she treasured those moments, those stretches of expanded time where she could simply be without the constant pressure to do, to achieve, to live up to expectations. Summer arrived, and with it, the holidays. The Montero family were planning to go to the coast again. Clara was ready to go, but part of her, as always, was reluctant to leave her room, that magical space where time behaved in a special way. The night before they left, she went up to her room and spent several hours there, sitting in the dark, listening to the nighttime sounds of the city, feeling time thicken around her like a warm blanket. She wondered if, when she returned, the phenomenon would continue. What if it was something fleeting, something that depended on her age, on her particular stage of development? What if, as she grew up, as she became an adult, she lost this ability? The possibility filled her with a deep sadness, almost like anticipated grief. But when they returned in August, tanned and full of stories of the sea, when Clara went up to her room for the first time after 2 weeks away, time welcomed her like an old friend. It slowed down almost immediately, as if it too had been waiting. And Clara knew, with that certainty that requires no proof, that this gift would not abandon her. It was part of who she was. It was part of that place. It was part of the relationship between her and that place. In the autumn of that year, when Clara began her final year of secondary school, she was a 17-year-old girl with a serenity unusual for her age. Her teachers admired her. Her classmates respected her, though they did not always understand her. She had plans to study philosophy at university, to explore academically the questions she had been grappling with practically for years. What is time? What is consciousness? How are they related to one another? But she knew that no amount of academic study could fully explain what she had experienced in that third-floor room. Some truths can only be lived, not analyzed. Some mysteries resist the light of reason, not because they are irrational, but because They are greater than reason, deeper than language. On the afternoons of that autumn, Clara would often sit at her window, watching the leaves fall from the trees once more, completing another cycle. In the slow time of her room, she could follow every leaf, appreciate every turn, every spiraling descent. And in those moments, she felt immense gratitude for this inexplicable gift. For these minutes she had learned to wait for this space where time became generous, patient, kind. Night fell early now, as autumn gave way to winter. The shadows lengthened in her room. The wall clock marked the hours with its constant ticking, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always present. And Clara, sitting in the gathering gloom, with her notebook on her lap and pen in her hand, wrote. She wrote about time and eternity, about moments and eras, about how a life is measured not in years but in presence, not in quantity but in quality, not in speed but in depth. Outside, the city continued its frenetic pace. People rushed from one place to another, chasing clocks, keeping to schedules, living under the constant tyranny of time that never waits. But here, in this third-floor room, in this space outside normal time, Clara had found a refuge, a place where the minutes were generous, where the seconds paused to converse, where time itself had learnt the virtue of patience. And as she wrote, as the words flowed from her pen onto the paper, Clara smiled, because she knew a secret that the world had forgotten. She knew that time is not the enemy, that life is not a race against the clock, that there is another way of being, another way of inhabiting moments, a way where every instant is complete in itself, where every second contains infinities. The moon was beginning to rise above the city rooftops. Its silvery light streamed through the window, illuminating the room with that soft glow that transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. And in that light, in that moment, suspended between day and night, between the past and the future, Clara existed fully in the present, in the expanded now, in the moment she had learned to wait for. The room where time slowed down. Chapter 2. The breath of the clock. Night has fallen over the city like a cloak of dark velvet, and somewhere amongst the cobbled streets and buildings that harbour centuries-old secrets, there is a room that defies the immutable laws of the universe. A room where every second stretches like golden taffy under the heat of the sun, where minutes turn into hours and hours into whispering eternities. In the previous chapter, we discovered the existence of this impossible place, hidden on the third floor of a building that most people walk past without a second glance. We met those who, by accident or by fate, crossed its threshold and experienced the phenomenon that defies all rational explanation. But tea or night, as the stars twinkle in the sky like curious eyes observing our little world, we delve deeper into the mystery. Tonight we shall hear the clock's breathing. The room waits in silence. Its cream-colored walls absorb the dim light filtering through the lace curtains, those very curtains that have witnessed decades of moments suspended in time. The wooden floor creaks with an almost imperceptible softness, as if the house itself were breathing, inhaling and exhaling with a rhythm that does not belong to this world we know. In the center of the room, on an oak table carved in 1922 by a craftsman whose name has been lost in the folds of time, rests the clock. It is no ordinary clock. Its bronze case has taken on a bluish-green patina over the years, as if time itself had left its visible mark on the very object meant to measure it. The hands move with an exasperating slowness, almost mocking, as if they knew a secret they will never share. Tick, tock, tick, tock. But these sounds do not mark the seconds as we know them. Between every tick and every tock, there is an abyss of stillness, a void that expands and contracts like the lungs of a living being. When someone enters the room for the first time, the first thing they notice is not the furniture or the sepia photographs hanging on the walls. The first thing they perceive is that breathing. It is a sound so subtle that it could be mistaken for the wind whispering through the branches of the trees, or for the distant beat of a heart pumping blood through invisible veins. But once it is heard, once consciousness latches onto that strange, enveloping rhythm, it becomes impossible to ignore. Dr. Heinrich Müller was the first to document this phenomenon systematically. It was the autumn of 1937 when this German physicist, fleeing the growing political darkness enveloping his homeland, arrived in this port city seeking refuge and anonymity. Müller was a methodical man, obsessed with precision and exact measurement. He carried with him 3 pocket stopwatches, each calibrated with Swiss precision, and a black leather diary in which he recorded every observation in small, meticulous handwriting. The first time Müller entered the room was purely by chance. He was looking for a quiet place where he could work on his equations without being disturbed, far from the suspicious glances of those who saw every German as a potential enemy. The landlady, an elderly woman with hazel eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances, offered him the room on the 3rd floor. She warned him, with an enigmatic smile that crinkled the corners of her lips, that was a special place. Müller, absorbed in his thoughts on quantum mechanics and relativity, barely paid any attention to her words. He entered the room at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday. He knew this for certain because he checked his 3 stopwatches before crossing the threshold. The autumn sun painted golden rectangles on the wooden floor. He sat down in the chair by the table, opened his diary, and began to work. The equations flowed from his pen like water from a spring. The numbers danced before his eyes, revealing patterns and symmetries that filled him with a quiet satisfaction. Time seemed to matter little as his mind navigated the abstract dimensions of pure mathematics. When he finally looked up, tired but satisfied, he glanced at his stopwatches. They all read 3:47. He had been working for 47 minutes, according to his precise instruments. But when he looked out of the window, the light had changed completely. It was no longer the golden afternoon he remembered. The sky had turned a deep purple, that color which only appears when the day is about to yield to the night. The street lamps were beginning to come on, one after another, like earthly stars awakening from their daytime slumber. Müller felt a shiver run down his spine. He checked his stopwatches again and again, shaking them gently against his ear to make sure their mechanisms were working properly. They all still read 3:47, but judging by the position of the sun and the shadows stretching like dark fingers across the buildings, at least 4 hours had passed. Perhaps 5. That night, in his small guest room 2 floors below, Müller could not sleep. His scientific mind rebelled against what he had experienced. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps he had suffered some sort of dissociative episode, a temporary lapse caused by the stress of exile. Perhaps the stopwatches were faulty. Perhaps he was losing his mind. But the next day he returned to the room, this time prepared. He brought with him not only his 3 stopwatches, but also a portable pendulum clock, a new notebook dedicated exclusively to this experiment, and an ironclad determination to solve the mystery. He entered the room at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, checking the time against the clock on the nearby church tower, which tolled solemnly on the hour. He sat down again in the same chair. This time he did not work on equations. He simply observed. He stared intently at the second hand of his most precise stopwatch, counting every tick whilst simultaneously listening to that strange sound that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. That slow, deep breathing of the antique clock resting on the table. And then he felt it. It was as if the air around him had grown denser, as if he were submerged in invisible honey. His own movements seemed normal to him. His breathing flowed at its usual pace. His heart beat with its familiar rhythm. But when he looked at the second hand of the stopwatch, it seemed to move with an unnatural slowness. 1 second stretched out, and then another, each lasting an eternity before the slender hand moved to the next mark. Muller remained seated for what his subjective experience told him was approximately an hour. He read 23 pages of a physics book he had brought with him. He drank a whole glass of water. He paced back and forth across the room, counting his steps, reaching 232 before sitting down again. And when he finally decided to leave the room and check the time outside, he discovered that barely 12 minutes had passed. The phenomenon was real, indisputable, reproducible. Over the following weeks, Muller carried out experiment after experiment. He measured, calculated, theorized. He discovered that the effect was not constant. Some days, time inside the room flowed only slightly slower than outside. Other days, the discrepancy was dramatic. He could spend what felt like hours inside that room, only to step out and discover that the outside world had moved on by barely a few minutes. He tried to find patterns. Did it depend on the time of day, on the phase of the moon, on the temperature, on his own state of mind? He filled notebook after notebook with data, graphs, hypotheses, but no physical theory he knew of could explain what he was experiencing. Einstein had shown that time was relative, that it could dilate under certain extreme conditions related to speed and gravity. But this was different. This was happening in an ordinary room, in an ordinary building, in an ordinary city. One November afternoon, as the rain tapped gently against the window panes, creating a rhythmic and soothing pattern, Muller had a revelation. It was not the result of complex calculations or elaborate experiments. It was something simpler, more intuitive. He was sitting in the room, listening to the steady ticking of the clock, when he suddenly realized that his own breathing had synchronized with that rhythm. He inhaled when the clock seemed to inhale. He exhaled when the clock exhaled. And in that moment of perfect synchronization, he felt something he had never experienced before. A profound peace, a stillness that was not the absence of movement, but the presence of something more fundamental. It was as if time itself were holding him, gently rocking him, inviting him to rest in its eternal arms. Muller remained in that state for what seemed to him like a blessed eternity. He did not think about the equations that had obsessed him for years. He did not think of the war brewing in his homeland. He did not think of the uncertain future that lay ahead. He simply existed in that expanded moment, breathing in time with the clock, feeling every cell in his body relax and surrender to that ancient, wise pulse. When he finally left the room that afternoon, he discovered that only 20 minutes had passed in the outside world. But he felt as though he had slept deeply for 8 hours. His mind was clear, his body rested, his spirit renewed. For the first time since he had fled Germany, he felt something akin to hope. But Müller was not the only one to discover the unique properties of that room. Over the decades, others found their way to that third floor, each seeking something different, each finding exactly what they needed. There was Margaret, a young nurse working grueling shifts at the hospital during the Second World War. The year was 1943, and the city, though far from the front line, felt the weight of the war on every corner. Margaret cared for wounded soldiers returning from combat, men with shattered bodies and even more fragmented minds. She worked 18 hours a day, sometimes more, and exhaustion had become her constant companion, a weight she carried on her shoulders like a leaden cloak. A colleague told her about the room. She told her it was a place where she could rest, really rest, even if she only had a few spare minutes between shifts. Margaret was skeptical, but she was so desperate for a little peace that she decided to give it a try. She climbed the stairs of the building on a rainy day in March, her wet shoes leaving footprints on the wooden steps. When she entered the room, the first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the empty, tense silence of the hospital between emergencies, but a full, rich silence, like the space between the notes of a symphony. He took off his shoes and lay down on the sofa, leaning against the wall. A sofa upholstered in green velvet that had seen better days. He closed his eyes and began to listen to the ticking of the clock. At first it seemed strange to her, almost unsettling, but gradually, as her own breathing fell into step with that rhythm, she felt the tension leave her body. The muscles in her shoulders, always tense from the long hours spent bent over patients' beds, began to relax. The constant pressure behind her eyes, that perpetual headache she had learned to ignore, began to dissipate like mist in the morning sun. Margaret fell asleep. It was not the restless, unsatisfying sleep she had grown accustomed to, filled with fragmented images of blood-stained bandages and cries of pain. It was a deep, restorative sleep, the kind of sleep she had forgotten was possible. She dreamed of a garden where flowers with no names grew, beneath a sky the color of liquid amber. In that garden there was no urgency, no alarms, no death lurking around every corner. When she woke up, she felt as though she had slept all night. She felt refreshed, revitalized, ready to face any challenge. She looked at her nurse's watch, expecting to see that the whole afternoon had passed. But the second hand told her that barely 35 minutes had elapsed since she had entered the room. Margaret returned to the room whenever she could. Between shifts, during her brief breaks, in those stolen moments when the world demanded more than she could give. And every time, the room sustained her. The clock breathed with her, for her, reminding her that there was a rhythm deeper than the constant urgency of war and suffering. Years later, after the war had ended and Margaret had become an elderly woman with silver hair and hands that trembled slightly as she held a cup of tea, she would tell her granddaughter about that room. She would tell her that that place had saved her, that without those moments suspended in time, without that healing breath of the clock, she would not have survived those dark years with her humanity intact. The room also welcomed Thomas, a composer who had lost his inspiration. It was the year 1968, a time of change and turbulence, when the world seemed to be waking from a long sleep and discovering that reality was far stranger and more complicated than anyone had imagined. Thomas had been considered a prodigy in his youth, composing complex and beautiful symphonies that had been performed in the finest theaters across Europe. But something had broken inside him. The music that used to flow like an overflowing river had dried up, leaving only a barren bed where there had once been abundance. He had tried everything. He traveled to exotic places in search of inspirat, quieten. He experimented with substances that promised to expand his consciousness. He consulted therapists who assured him that he simply needed to work through his psychological blocks. Nothing worked. The notes in his head had fallen silent, and the silence was deafening. A musician friend, knowing his desperation, told him about the room. He said it was a place where time behaved strangely, where minutes could turn into hours. Thomas thought that perhaps that was exactly what he needed: more time. Time to think, to explore, to rediscover those elusive melodies that used to visit him so easily. He entered the room one spring evening when the cherry blossoms filled the air with their sweet, melancholic scent. He sat down at the old piano in the corner, an instrument that no one had tuned in years. The keys were yellowed and some notes sounded muffled, but Thomas didn't mind. He placed his fingers on the keys and waited. At first, nothing happened. His fingers remained motionless, heavy as stone. But then he heard the clock's breathing. That steady rhythm, that pulse that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the mere mechanism of gears and springs. And without consciously thinking about it, his fingers began to move. He wasn't playing recognizable melodies. They weren't the scales and arpeggios he'd practiced thousands of times. It was something new, something born directly from that space where time became elastic and malleable. The notes flowed to the rhythm of the clock's breathing. Some chords lasted an eternity, lingering in the air like birds suspended in the wind. Others passed swiftly, barely touching his consciousness before transforming into something completely different. Thomas played for what felt like the whole night. The music that emerged from his fingers was strange and beautiful, melancholic and hopeful at the same time. It was the music of time itself, the sound of moments expanding and contracting, of seconds breathing like living creatures. When he finally stopped, with tears running down his cheeks without him realizing when they had begun to fall, he looked out of the window. The sun had not yet set completely. According to the clock hanging on the wall in the corridor outside the room, only an hour had passed. But Thomas had found what he was looking for. It wasn't just inspiration. It was something deeper. It was a reconnection with the very source of creativity, that place beyond linear time where all melodies exist simultaneously, waiting to be discovered. He returned to the room many times in the years that followed, and each visit brought him new compositions. Some he shared with the world, others he kept to himself, private treasures too precious to be exposed to criticism and analysis. His most famous work, a piece he called The Breath, was composed entirely in that room during what the outside world measured as 3 hours, but which for him were 3 full days of uninterrupted musical exploration. When the piece premiered in the year 1972, the critics were baffled. Some called it brilliant. Others found it impenetrable, But everyone agreed that there was something different about that music, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. It was as if time itself were woven into the notes, as if every bar contained more space than should be possible. The room continued to exist through the decades, silent and patient, waiting for those who would need it. The building that housed it changed hands several times. Renovations were carried out on other floors. Walls were painted. Pipes were replaced. But no one ever touched the room on the third floor. It was as if it existed in its own bubble of reality, separated from the normal flow of time and change. And the clock kept ticking. Tick, tock, tick, tock. But between each sound lay a universe of stillness, an ocean of silence where anything was possible. Some said that the clock had been made by a craftsman who had discovered some ancient secret, some lost knowledge about the nature of time. Others believed that the room itself had existed long before the building, that the building had simply been built around this sacred place where the normal laws did not apply. No one knew the whole truth. Perhaps there was no truth to be known, not in the conventional sense. Perhaps the room was simply a gift, a crack in the rigid structure of time where weary people could rest, where the lost could find themselves, where the silenced could hear the music of the universe once more. In recent years, when the world sped up even further, when seconds began to feel like milliseconds and days blurred into featureless weeks, the room became more important than ever. People came to it exhausted by the relentless pace of modern life, fed up with the tyranny of deadlines and notifications, desperate for a respite that no weekend or holiday could provide. And the room welcomed them all. It did not discriminate. It did not judge. It asked for nothing in return. It simply offered its unique gift, time that stretched like taffy, moments that expanded to contain eternities, breath that healed. Some visitors learned to meditate in sync with the clock. They discovered that when they aligned their breathing with that ancient rhythm, they could access states of consciousness that usually required years of dedicated practice. They experienced moments of perfect clarity where problems that seemed unsolvable suddenly revealed their solutions. They felt their minds expand, encompassing possibilities that had been there all along, but which the speed of normal life had concealed. Others simply slept. They curled up on the green sofa or stretched out on the soft carpet and drifted into dreams deeper and more restorative than anything they had ever experienced in their own beds. Sleep in the room was different. It was like being held by time itself, rocked in the arms of something vast and ancient and fundamentally benevolent. There were those who came to the room to weep. They brought their sorrows, their losses, their broken hearts, and they wept without haste, without the pressing clock of obligations waiting for them. They wept until there were no more tears, and then wept a little more. And when they finally left, with red eyes but a lighter heart, they discovered they had only been absent from the outside world for a few minutes, though their grieving process had taken hours or even days in inner time. The clock watched all this with its serene face, its hands moving with that deliberate slowness, marking a time that was not the world's time. Its breathing continued, constant as the tides, regular as the seasons. Inhalation, exhalation, a rhythm that had existed before the first human entered the room and would continue long after the last. Some scientists, following in Müller's footsteps, attempted to study the phenomenon with increasingly sophisticated instruments. They brought atomic clocks that measured time with a precision bordering on perfection. They brought equipment to measure electromagnetic fields, gravitational anomalies, and distortions in the fabric of space-time. Is greater than, but all their instruments told the same paradoxical story. Inside the room, time passed exactly as it should. There was no measurable slowing down. The atomic clocks ticked away the seconds with perfect regularity. The electromagnetic fields were completely normal. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that could explain why people's subjective experiences differed so dramatically from what the instruments reported. Some concluded that it was purely psychological, an altered state of consciousness that made time seem slower without it actually being so. But this did not explain how different people, independently of one another, reported the same effects. It did not explain how someone could read an entire book in what was, externally, 15 minutes, or how a composer could create an entire symphony in an hour. Others theorized about additional dimensions, about folds in reality where time flowed differently. They spoke of string theory and parallel universes, of quantum consciousness and morphogenetic fields. They devised elegant equations and complex models. But in the end, they all admitted they were speculating, building mathematical sandcastles that the next experiment might knock down. Perhaps the wisest explanation came from an elderly woman who had visited the room regularly for 50 years. She was 93 when she finally shared her perspective with a young researcher who asked her what she thought was happening in that room. She smiled with that smile that comes only from having lived long enough to know that not everything needs to be explained. Time is like a river, she told him in a voice as soft as worn velvet. We usually let ourselves be carried along by its current, moving at the speed it dictates. But this room, this breathing clock, teaches us that we can change our relationship with that river, is greater than. We don't stop the water. We don't speed it up. We simply learn to swim in a different way. And when you swim differently, you experience the river differently. The young researcher wrote this in his notebook, even though he knew it would never appear in any scientific publication. It wasn't data. It wasn't verifiable. But on some deep level that his academic training had not been able to completely eradicate, he knew she was right. The seasons continued to change outside the room. The leaves on the trees turned from green to gold to brown, finally falling to nourish the earth before new leaves sprouted in spring. People grew old. Is greater than buildings, fell into disrepair and were renovated. Fashions changed. Wars began and ended. Technology advanced at a pace that would have seemed magical to previous generations. But inside the room, something remained constant. That rhythm, that breath, that space where time became malleable and generous, where moments expanded to contain exactly what each visitor needed. And the clock kept ticking away its strange time. Its gears, which should have worn out decades ago, continued to run with perfect smoothness. No one wound it up, at least not that anyone had seen. But it never stopped. Tick, tock, tick, tock. And between each sound, that infinite space where anything was possible. On the quietest nig, HTS, when the city settled down and the noise of traffic faded to a distant murmur, if you stood in the street and looked up at the third-floor window, you could see a faint light shining behind the lace curtains. And if you listened very carefully, with the kind of attention that requires silencing all your thoughts and worries, you might hear something. It wouldn't be the steady ticking of an ordinary clock. It would be something deeper, more organic, like the heartbeat of time itself. Some visitors swore that the room was alive, not in the biological sense, but in a more fundamental sense. They said they could feel its presence, its consciousness, that the room knew them, understood them, responded to their specific needs. One person might need energy, and the room would give them a revitalizing rest. Another might need peace, and the room would offer them a deep calm. A third might need clarity, and the room would create the exact mental space for confused thoughts to untangle and organize themselves. And always, there was the ticking of the clock, the rhythm that connected everything, the pulse that reminded every visitor that they too were part of something greater, something timeless, that beyond deadlines and appointments and alarm clocks and calendars, there existed a deeper time, a time not measured in minutes and hours, but in breaths and heartbeats. A time that did not race towards any destination but simply was. The eternal present. The night deepens outside. The stars continue their slow rotation across the dark sky. Somewhere, someone is waking up. Elsewhere, someone is falling asleep. The world turns on its axis, indifferent to the small lives unfolding on its surface. The universe is expanding. Galaxies are moving away from one another. Time flows inexorably towards the future. But in a room on the third floor of a building that has seen more than 100 years pass, time moves at its own pace. It stretches. It expands. It breathes. And in that breath, in that space between the ticks and talks, there is refuge. There is healing. There is a reminder that time is not our master but our companion, that we can dance with it rather than be swept along by its current. The clock continues its silent work. Its hands move forward with that deliberate slowness. Its breath fills the space, and it waits. It always waits, because it knows more visitors will come, more weary people seeking rest, more lost souls seeking the way, more broken hearts seeking healing, and to each one, the room will offer its gift. Time. Not time in the conventional sense, but transformed time. Time that has become spacious and generous. Time that heals rather than wounds. Time that sustains rather than pressures. On this quiet night, whilst the world sleeps or pretends to sleep, whilst dreams dance behind closed eyelids and thoughts slow to a whisper, the room remains. The clock breathes, and somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, between now and then, between the second that has just passed and the one yet to come, there is a space where time itself rests, a space where you too could rest if you found your way to that door, if you climbed those stairs, if you entered that room where time slows down and the clock's breathing lulls you into a sleep deeper than any you have known before.
Release the tension in your forehead. Relax the muscles around your eyes. Let your arms rest completely, heavy and warm at either side of your body. Your breath now flows naturally, like gentle waves lapping at the shore and receding effortlessly. The stories you have heard tonight slowly fade away, becoming distant whispers that you no longer need to follow. If this journey through time has served you well, you can support this space by liking, subscribing, or sharing your thoughts in the comments. That way, more people seeking rest may find refuge here. And if you are still awake, there is another story waiting in silence, ready to guide you deeper into sleep. But for now, let the voices of the past fade gently away. Let the names, dates, and events melt into the mist of the night's oblivion. The story can wait until tomorrow. Close your eyes. Let go of everything. Rest deeply, and may you have sweet dreams.